Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to welcome you to this webinar, a book launch. Lihle Ngcobozi is launching her new book, Mothers. To hear more on this book from her. We also are really privileged to have Dr Sithembile Mbete from the University of Pretoria joining us as a discussant and a chair of this book launch. Really appreciate your time, Sithembile. I know that you featured quite a bit in some of our webinars. We really appreciate that, and also for your insights and your take on this book, which personally as I read through it, I thought it's a very timely work to give us a new lens for understanding the Black Women's associations in the church and transcending sort of the traditional view that saw women's associations as through the lens of docility and as about the place that a patriarchal society has assigned to them, but also to understand these associations as partly sites of struggles, but also a place for that women use to find solace. So we really are incredibly excited to have you, Lihle, presenting this work and also to take us through it. What led you to write this work. So we really are very excited. And for those who are participating in our webinars for the first time, we've been running these, I think, since March, April this year, just after lockdown, and they've been well attended. We've had various themes, various speakers who've come to present on this platform. And would like to hear from you to get your feedback on the themes that we discuss and how we can improve this. We also would like to persuade you to consider joining one of our programs at Wits School of Governance. As a school, we're positioning ourselves to respond to the public policy and governance challenges of the day, and we want to train to empower the new generation of leaders, a new cadre in the public service, a new cadre in the civic structure. So we have a wide-ranging programs that we offer at the school. So please check us out and feel free to write to one of our academics to inquire more on our programs. I hope you enjoy this discussion today. All the best, Lihle. I'm sure that this will be a very robust talk. And once again, thanks, Te. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Mzu. Thanks, Prof. It's such an honor to be here to facilitate this event. Mzuguzi and I are former colleagues. When I first started at the University of Pretoria, he was a colleague who really held my hand through a lot of things. So it's always wonderful to be part of an event with you. We've shared many panels together, but also to be a part of this event in your new position as the head of the School of Governance. So it's a great pleasure.
Thank you so much, Ted. Appreciate it.
And to be talking about this really exciting new book by Lihle Ngcobozi, who is a lecturer in development and governance at the Wits School of Governance. She graduated from Rhodes University with a master's degree in political studies and international relations in 2017, in which she explored how the Women's Manyano Church Group offers a space for the public performance of citizenship by Black women. Ngcobozi holds a postgraduate degree in international relations. She also has an Alan Gray Center of Leadership Ethics Fellowship and is currently an Atlantic Philanthropy Scholar. Previously, she worked as a researcher at Iranti, which focused on the development of LGBTI rights in Southern Africa. Her research interests include gendered approaches to citizenship and understanding the public sphere, post-apartheid feminisms, and early intellectual histories of women in constitutional politics. Now, I was so excited when I was asked to be a discussant and to facilitate this conversation because I am the child of a Methodist minister. And so I grew up in the Methodist Church. I come from a long line of Methodist ministers. I think the first ordained Methodist, Mbete, Charles Mbete, was ordained in 1890 something or 1880 something. So I've sort of grown up in the Methodist Church, grown up with Omama Manyano my whole life. In fact, just last week, I was in Ladysmith for the funeral of my maternal grandmother's younger sister, and have took all of the photos of the mamas in their uniform or koko, you know, bidding farewell to one of their own. And there's always such poignance for me in that moment. And so much of what I know about public life, about public belonging, about citizenship, comes from the women of Manyano. So, you know, having that written academically, something that, and you know, where so much of our academic life as young Black people, as Black South Africans, often feels very alien because you are learning about these concepts and these things that are very far away from you. And so to have a new generation of scholars that's writing about, I mean, if you told me 10 years ago that I'd be reading a book about Manyano that was based on like Habermas, I would have told you you're crazy. And so to be reading that kind of scholarship that's so located and that's so rooted in our experience as South Africans specifically, as Africans in general, but also that has a great deal of universal relevance, and that has that provides insights on these big concepts that we use to understand the world in social science, I think is really exceptional. What's also great, so for everybody to tell you to write the book, is that Lihle writes so beautifully. Academics, and especially academics that have been trained in international relations, often write terribly because it's this sort of staid, stodgy language to try and maintain this objectivity that we get trained in IR, you know, is the ultimate ideal. And so to read something that was written with great academic rigor, but with such accessibility and in such an enjoyable way is fantastic. And so just to give you a bit of a taster of that, the first paragraph of the book begins, and chapter 1 is titled "In Search of My Grandmother's Garden." And on the first page, I begin, "In the living room of our house in KwaZulu-Natal is a portrait. In this portrait, my great-grandmother sits on a bench outside our home in Mthatha, looking out into the vastness of the land. This land is the land that provided for generations of the Ngcobozi family. She and her husband cultivated this land with their hands and toiled the soil that bore fruit for all 6 of their children. In the portrait, she sits on the bench, legs folded into each other with a worn black Bible on her lap. She appears too shy to look into the camera, but steals a glimpse at it nonetheless. Behind her stands a tall man, his skin birthed by the sun and hair now giving away the life he has lived. His hands are on her shoulders. I take a closer look and see hands that have held the earth and nurtured the offspring of seeds. He looks directly into the camera. He does not smile. And then so on. Just that hooks you and makes you want to know more and to read more, but also the deep familiarity of having a similar picture in my own family that remains as this great reference. And so that's how I want to open it and just say that I'm really excited to be here to talk about this book and to hear more from Lihle about it. Lihle is going to present, give us just a brief presentation of the journey of writing the book and some of the themes, and then we'll take up the conversation from there. I'd like to remind everyone that you can ask questions using, those of you who are on the Zoom call, using the Q&A function and the chat function that's at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to start shooting your questions and your comments already. And for those of you who are joining us on Facebook, you can ask your questions in the comment function on Facebook, and they will be fed back to us here. Lihle, take it away.
Thank you so much for that wonderful opening, and thank you to Mzu as well for the introductory remarks. So this is my book, Mothers of the Nation. It started off as a master's in 2015, and it really was wanting to look at the ways in which the church offers Black women the space to participate quite differently and to participate in politics outside of state confines in ways that offers them the ability to perform and to also have access to their citizenship outside of this dominant understanding of the state being sort of the conduit of one's ability to perform or have access to a particular kind of citizenship. And so what I wanted to do really was to show that the nature in which Black women's lives, due to colonialism, apartheid, and the ways in which race and gender most of the time demarcate the different ways in which people experience the world, an institution such as the church also should be looked at through that particular lens. So being able to make use of concepts such as gender, race, the economy, socioeconomic stratification, and all of these big concepts that we learn in academia, and to try and find a way to use them in our own context and to make these concepts available for us to be able to explore the ways in which our communities and our institutions and matriarchal foundations, such as the church, allow women to have accesses to particular ways of being that are not necessarily always given to them by the state. And so really what I was trying to do here was to offer a different kind of reading of the church that moves away from dominant historiography of the church as a colonial construct that was, handed over to us through colonial imposition, specifically in the Transkei regions at the time, and that really the church has no space that offers women the ability to express themselves outside of this idea of Victorian Christianity, which dictates the ways in which women are supposed to express motherhood and the ways in which they're supposed to be confined to this idea of domesticity, and the ways in which the church in and of itself is quite intrinsic in creating gender roles and gender positions, not only in the private sphere such as the home, but also in the public sphere when we think about the ways in which politics operates. And so what I wanted to do was to say, that might be true, and that might have some form of historical accuracy. However, there's something more to it, and that there's something particularly interesting about the ways in which indigenous institutions, the ways in which Black people and Black women specifically have been able to infuse indigenous aspects of being around spirituality, around church, around song, around movement, around different other things as well. And they've been able to infuse this within these seemingly colonial and oppressive structures in ways that actually allow for them to have particular agencies and to have particular powers and to have particular authorities within their communities, but also within the church space as well. And so what I wanted to do is also really debunk this idea of firstly dealing with things, dealing with memory, the ways in which we understand how totalizing concepts such as colonialism, apartheid, gender, and race, how these actually have different technologies that we can use in order to be able to understand the different ways in which it works for different people. So for that, I mean the ways in which gender and race, and the ways in which we create memory and historiography around the church and apartheid and all of that, how that can be read differently if we really just choose to apply our minds, or in ways that remove ourselves from universalizing concepts and universal approaches to understanding oppression and universal approaches to understanding the ways in which gender and race work. So really what I wanted to do was to then, through these, applying a particular feminist lens, which really works to shift the technologies of memory, which is what Phumla Gqola uses in a lot of her work, is that we really try to position and create a different type of picture than one that exists. So what I wanted to do then was to show that Omama Manyano aren't this docile group that exists in the church that just prays and they just go about their way, and there's nothing really interesting, there's nothing particularly insightful, and there's nothing political about the way in which they organize themselves. And what I wanted to then say is that we need to begin to position them firstly as an authority within our communities, and that there's a reason why that they have remained part and parcel of Black life and their continued authority within our communities. And second of all, to also position them as an institution of knowledge, and in the ways in which Dr. Makopana also speaks about matriarchal foundations being institutions of knowledge for Black people, to position the Manyanos as an institution and as a body of knowledge that we can glean quite rich and deep theoretical concepts from, in ways that unfortunately academia doesn't often read Black women in that way. And we're often, these type of institutions are seen as anecdotal. And that was one of the comments that I had received from one of the markers, that this is quite an anecdotal project, and there really is not a lot of theory to it, and that because I had used so much of the narratives as the base of the theory that I was then working through and sort of developing new ways of thinking, I ran into that problem of just being told that this is quite an anecdotal project. And my rebuttal to that was, no, it's not, because I've been able to make use of concepts such as the public sphere, making use of counter-publics, being able to understand the bifurcated nature of the ways in which race and gender separates the ways in which people experience the world, and how that bifurcated nature also then it requires us to think differently about different subjectivities within different positionalities within that bifurcatedness. So for me, going into this book then was to prove that this is not an anecdotal institution, and that there's quite rich theories that we can glean out related to feminism, related to the ways in which women engage with the state, and the ways in which women carve out spaces outside of the state that give them the recognition that the state often does not give, but also it gives them a recognition that they wouldn't otherwise, that they don't actually want from the state. So when the state is not that type of, when the state is no longer the conduit of citizenship, what avenues are available for women to be able to make use of these ideas of citizenship? And this is why then I looked to the church. And so, as I've said, Manyano are also quite profound in that they make use of matriarchy in quite interesting ways. And as you'll see in the book, is that I juxtapose quite a lot of their understanding of motherhood, womanhood, and ubufazi, and I juxtapose that with dominant theorization, specifically around gender, and also the ways in which Western or white feminist scholarship have attempted to rebut this idea of women being solely understood through conventional identities such as motherhood and womanhood to some extent. And what I argue is that there is, although these concepts may at first hand appear to be quite oppressive, and that they position women, you know, in ways that are belittling and so on and so forth. I do think that the ways in which motherhood has been used and continues to be used, specifically within these institutions, show us that there's more to it as opposed to just having a reading of it as being inherently oppressive. And as I show in the book, I take you through the ways in which the women's Manyano groups and the larger body of Black women's communities and societies made use of motherhood as a springboard into their activism, and also as a springboard into anti-apartheid struggle and anti-apartheid movements in general, which are part and parcel specifically within the township communities around the state of emergency. So the ways in which motherhood can be, and ubufazi and womanhood, enters into the public sphere in quite unique ways. For me, it tells me that there's something particularly different, and think about the ways in which motherhood can be used in ways that are quite unconventional, and also in ways that sometimes do not neatly fit into the dominant Western understanding of the ways in which motherhood is oppressive. So yeah, and then I go through a lot of other themes that you can find in the book around spirituality, prayer, ukubekezela, endurance, and I think what's important is to make use of these concepts as they are in the languages that I found them in, and not to translate them, but to just give an understanding of the ways in which ukubekezela, which can be read as strength or perseverance, and prayer, uthandaza, and all of those things are quite prominent in the ways in which this idea of motherhood and the matriarchal foundations are constituted. And so what the book then argues is that because race and gender have become so totalizing and universal, what I do then is to sort of extract Manyano from that universalizing concept and really offer quite a different reading, one which makes use of their contexts, their positionalities, their language, the ways in which they create their own knowledge systems and institutions. And hopefully what you'll find in the book, that it will then begin to give us a fresher understanding of not only Manyano, but also the ways in which Black women make use of particular institutions in our communities through quite unconventional and seemingly oppressive subjectivities. And so, yeah, I think I'll end there, and then we can take some thoughts from your side.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And as you were talking, I thought of something that Eleanor Sisulu, a comment that she once made somewhere I heard her speak, where she said, you know, decolonizing scholarship needs to begin with knowing ourselves and with understanding and having ourselves as sources of knowledge, and our people, our ancestors, as an institution of knowledge, that framing. And I think that this book is such an excellent contribution to that process in this particular moment of our life as a country, but also to really take up that call from Prof. Gola about shifting the technologies of memory, because so much of the colonial project was reliant on destroying memory, on making it difficult to have and to have memory, to have archive. Yeah. And so, you know, we're very much engaged in a process of creating an archive from scratch. And I think, and the irony, of course, is then when that is looked at through the lens of Western academic thought, it's anecdotal. Yeah. And so much of Western-centric knowledge production or European, you know, knowledge production is based on this idea that you can generalize from the Western experience. Yeah. You can generalize from the white experience, and that you can't generalize from the Black experience, from experiences of the global South, even though numerically, so demographically, the experiences of Black South African Manyano women are the norm of understanding South Africa. They're not an anecdote. And globally, right, the experiences of Black and brown people in the world are the most common experience. And yet we have these constant challenges, and we're constantly being debated with about wanting to universalize from those experiences and from those conversations. And I think that what you successfully managed to theorize is how the experiences of the women that you speak about in the book can be applied more generally, not just in our context, but globally as well. And I think it's something for me, I'm sort of playing through in my head right now around understanding democracy and what the future of it is, especially on the African continent. If you think of a lot of, in Africa and in Eastern Europe, the third wave democracies modeled their democracies on the United States. And the US is a basket case. So we're realizing that many of the things that seemed pathological to Africa or to Eastern Europe are actually a problem of the system of democracy that has been applied. Because we're seeing the same things emerging in the US. And so in the absence then of that model, what new democratic system do we think of? What new way of the public do we think of? What new way of citizenship do we think of? And so first thing I want to then pick up on from what you said is that you frame something as, when the state is no longer the conduit of citizenship, what alternatives or options are there for women? And I'd like to probe something, or throw that back at you and say, in the South African context, where Black women did not have the option of citizenship until 1994, and even then were struggling to be seen as citizens in this society, that Manyano was not, that the sense of the state no longer being a conduit for citizenship isn't it. It's that there was no other option for citizenship, for the expression of citizenship for Black women, except through the church. Certainly in the period since the Union of South Africa in 1910, but I think, as you show, before then. And so I'd like to just throw that challenge back at you, but then ask you to reflect on some of the ways the women you spoke to exercise their citizenship through Manyano, in ways that are sort of analogous to what they would have done exercising citizenship through the state.
Okay. I think I'm probably also going to take a bit of flack in relation to this thing of the state, because people are so beholden onto the state. But when I mean the state, I mean in terms of, where do people find their recognition outside of the state being a resource, in whatever way that people deem the state to be a resource for, whether it's social grants, protections, or whatever security that the state is able to give individuals. I do think that the importance of the state from that perspective is still something that is quite important for a lot of South Africans, but also for Manyano women as well. Because I also speak about how the women in the post-apartheid moment are able to straddle this bifurcatedness between being able to get particular protection, their humanity and the recognition of their being at a spiritual and a humanity level, that comes from the church. And so you're right in saying that the state, in its conception, it never really was an entity which would allow for the recognition of Black women in their fullness, spiritually, and in other ways that the state really does not account for the different elements of citizenship. So really, citizenship is not really just about who has the ability to be recognized legalistically, or who has the opportunity to make particular claims of the state. But the state here is seen as something that, or rather women's abilities to seek recognition outside of the state speaks to the broader need of recognition that is not part and parcel of the ways in which we understand the state to operate. So women then turn to these alternative groupings or these alternative networks, which allow for a citizenship that is not particularly around resources, around legal recognition, which is important, but it is really centered around estima, which is sort of the dignity of the human being, understanding the human element of being. And what the church then does, and I also think because the church has always been, specifically the Black church and the formation of the Black church in South Africa through the liberation struggle and the ways in which the church was able to infuse politics with theology, and the ways in which the church was able to create this space in which Black women, Black people in general, were able to receive a particular kind of citizenship that was not reflected within the state. And I think as we transitioned then into the post-apartheid moment, the Black church still remained part of that, particularly with your traditional churches, your Methodists, your Anglicans, your Catholic churches, specifically the Black church within those traditional churches. So the ways in which then women outsource particular things that the state does not give them, that outsourcing then goes to the church. So you'll find things like churches also then deal with economic issues. So things like stokvela aren't just for fun, they're reflecting a particular kind of resource that is absent within the state. So that is how then people create economies within their communities, because the state is not able to give that. So really what the church then does, it creates pockets of recognition and pockets of resource building that wouldn't be found within the church. And then they're able to express particular elements of their citizenship within that particular space. And I think the prominence of the church, even in post-apartheid South Africa, and realizing the prominence that it has within our own political imagination of South Africa, is that we are still seeing political parties still leaning towards the church in times of crisis. We see political parties and the state in and of itself also leaning towards the church when they're in need of prayer, leaning towards the church when it's time for the elections, because we all know the iconography and the depth with which the church holds, specifically in Black communities. And it doesn't then surprise us that the state in and of itself also recognizes that there's something else that is happening outside of it that allows for a different kind of recognition that the state does not give. And so Manyano women do that in a number of ways, through funerals, burial societies, through stokvels, through their weekly meetings, which most of the time have still been infused with the material issues of the day, as it was during the apartheid moment, where church meetings became political sites of building strategies. We've also seen that in the post-apartheid moment as well, where the church, or the Manyanos group specifically, are also part of this grouping of women that use prayer and spirituality, and infusing that with the material conditions that they're finding themselves in. So there really has been no significant break between the ways in which the church and Black women specifically relate to the state.
Totally. Thank you. Thanks so much for that really comprehensive answer, and for pointing out this relationship between the politics and the church. I often say when I'm asked to speak about South African politics that for me, the ANC, yes, we talk about the ANC being a broad church, but it literally is like the church, in the sense that, you know, it's like the Methodist Church. There's one in every community, and you know, and someone will be and your family will have been members of it, and it becomes very difficult to stop being a member. And you actually see it even in the ANC Women's League. Their initiation or their induction process is very similar to the Manyano induction process, about the shoes that you wear, where you know, the oath that you give, and that whole process has become, they've taken on that symbolism and that imaginary because it is so powerful politically and socially, and so that also and I have this conversation often with scholars who try to draw comparisons between the Latin American evangelical Pentecostal movement and its influence on politics, and especially the traditional Black churches and their influence on politics in South Africa. And I tried to say that it is possible in South Africa as a Black person to be culturally Christian.
Yeah.
And almost the ways people can be culturally Jewish and atheist. I have many friends who aren't sure about the Christianity thing, but are very attached to the Black church, to Usiab Dumisa, to the songs, you know, when you, I mean, I at some point, as you know, stopped being able to go to white church services as I grew older, because you want to hear Usiab Dumisa, you want to be part of that ritual, because it's become such a big part of our cultural life. And I think that that's what you are explaining so well there about citizenship and statehood and belonging that's found through the church. I want to probe you. There's two questions that have been asked in the chat about how women's groupings can be infused into the GBV talks and recognizing their role in this instance. And I want to speak about that, or I'd like you to answer that question in relation to the theorizing on Ubegezela and that sort of racialized stereotype of the strong Black woman, which I know a lot of young women are contesting presently. And you quote here on page 100, Thembeni Pungula, when you asked her view on the differences she sees between the Manyano women of the past and those she encounters now. And she said, the Manyano has changed a lot since the time of our grandmothers. Our grandmothers were strong. They were very strong. Even when they used to sing, you could feel something move in your spirit because you could tell that this is someone who's been through a lot. Everyone in the room would have tears in their eyes when our grandmothers sang. We are not as strong. When one tiny thing happens, we want to give up. We don't have the strength to hold on. I don't know whether we do not pray hard enough, or maybe we do not have time for God, but it's no longer the same. It's unfortunate because this world is tougher than that time, and it really needs a strong praying woman who knows how to hold on. This world needs women who are strong in prayer. I do not think that Manyano women of our generation are as strong as our grandmothers, but we can only trust God and have faith that He will give us strength. And I want to place that view of Ubegezela and strength of Manyano women in counterpoint to this view on, you know, what's the role of Manyano in helping us deal with GBV, because so much of the rhetoric of Manyano around gender-based violence has been about Ubegezela, that you stay with a man even if he's beating you, or you don't make your problems other people's problems, you don't speak outside the house. And so how do we use, what's the fit really of that culture of doing things with the urgency of the discussions that we're currently, and, you know, of the problems that we're having right now around gender-based violence?
mean, that's a very tough one because, I mean, in no way am I trying to, and probably this is part of the critique that I'm sure I'll be getting as the weeks unfold and people engaging with the book, is that this is not a book that's meant to present Manyano as a perfect group of people that are not, that don't have their own problematics and that they don't have their own warped ideas of womanhood and all of the things related to that. However, what I wanted to show is that there's a particular kind of reading specifically related to a particular thing that we can make use of. So the thing of Inukubegezela and endurance, again, you know, the trope of Black womanhood has always been that we're strong, we're resilient, we can sustain families on our backs, we can, you know, we have this inbuilt characteristic of being strong people. And I do think part of strength, specifically for Black women as well, is that, and specifically for this generation of women who were part of the apartheid oppressive regime, who have then transitioned into the post-apartheid moment and haven't been able to glean the rewards of the post-apartheid prosperity rhetoric that we were seeing when we were ushered into this new political dispensation. And part of Ukubegezela for them and the idea of strength is that life is hard. Like materially, life is incredibly difficult for them. And life is incredibly harsh in relation to the fact that most of the women that I interviewed, a large majority of them were unemployed. A large majority of them are on a social grant. A large majority of them have worked till the bone and they're still working as domestic workers, even in their late 70s. Because there's just no other option for them because they haven't been educated. Their husbands and their kids as well. So that cycle of poverty is still quite dominant within their lived experiences and in their lives. And part of Ubegezela in that particular space has been around, where do I get the tools to cope with the structural inequalities and the legacies of apartheid? Where do I get the tools to do that? In the absence, again, of an economic framework in South Africa that does not allow or is not structured in a way that allows for us to be able to glean particular resources and to be able to get particular benefits that will drastically change our lives. And part of Ukubegezela then and the strength is to say, spirituality offers me the ability to navigate the life that I'm living. It gives me the tools to be able not to give up. It gives me the tools to be able to say, you know, in one of the interviews, I think Umam Kamisa, she says, 1 + 1 does not give me 2. And when it does not give me 2 and it gives me something else, I get dizzy because it's just too much. And so all of that speaks to the ways in which it is very, very, very difficult for a lot of the Manyano women that were part of the book, but also not for us to think that just because we are seeing a new kind of Manyano woman emerge, one that is culturally, one that culturally identifies with the group, that works in Sandton or works at River Wenzel or is an academic or, you know, has moved up the ranks in life, that is not the dominant narrative of the women that are part of this group. And most of them are still living in extreme precarity. And what endurance, strength, ubegezela, prayer, what they offer Black women the ability to have particular tools that they require to hold on. So in terms of GBV, I do not think the Manyano women have been able to, not even have been able, I don't think that they have taken a stance that is beyond the ways in which they think about womanhood, marriage, you know, all of that stuff. I don't think they've been able to transition out of that, and specifically the generation that came up, so the ones that are in their 60s up until the 80s, they really haven't been able to transition out of that type of thinking. And so you are finding that most of the church, they still hold quite warped ideas around marriageability, women's role in relation to their husband, and how the idea of silence and not speaking out against a husband because we've heard about that a lot. And I do think that although at a superficial level, they do take stances against rape, against GBV. I've seen over the years the marches that they've been part of, being out in their uniform and being speaking out against gender-based violence. But I don't think within the church there's an intrinsic conversation around the ways in which patriarchy in and of itself emboldens men, even within the church, to commit particular gender-based violences against women, against young women in the church as well, not just the Manyanos. But I don't think the church has actually grappled with that at the level at which it needs to. And I don't think the Methodist bishops as well have also, have been quite strong in their responses to GBV. And I don't think the Manyano women have followed suit as well, even though at a superficial level, they do on one level say that GBV is wrong, but the ways in which they understand the dynamics between husbands and wives is quite deeply problematic, and in some instances does contribute to the GBV type of rhetoric around women being owned by men and so on and so forth. But yeah, it's quite a difficult one.
Awesome, thank you. I think that does answer the question on please reflect on the role of the Manyano linked activities with community challenges versus before versus in the post-democratic dispensation. Would you say that they have the same vigor, comparatively speaking? I would now like to ask, or to move to one of the big things that you challenge in the book is this distinction between the private and the public sphere, and the Western notion of women being, of womanhood as being belonging in the private sphere, and the home, and the Western Christian notion of womanhood belonging in the home. Because one of the things that I find and as I was reading your book and thinking about it, is quite remarkable. And I've got a student at the moment who is writing on a master's on Phyllis and Dandala. And as soon as I got hold of your book, I said to her, listen, you must read, because one of the things we've been struggling with is this private-public divide, and how Western feminist literature very much is focused on this division between the private and the public, but also that African-American literature around the counter-public doesn't quite fit our context either, right? And I began to have the sense from your book that part of it is that in African tradition, women have a public role in whether it is ugyala in weddings and at weddings and initiation ceremonies or whatever, but women are not just confined to the home. Women have a very important public cultural role, especially older women. And what the Manyano tradition has done is that it's infused that cultural practice into Christianity, and so evolved Christianity's view of women, or the church's view of women, into something else completely. So I'd like to just hear a bit about your thoughts about what you've learned about or how conceptually your study of Manyano helped you in terms of that private-public divide, but also that feminist literature. And then two questions that have been asked here from Facebook, one from Joe Mavuso, who asks, in your write-up and investigation gathering, and your gathering of data, did you find any projects that Manyano is involved in that are developmental in communities where they exist? Or are the projects inward-looking for the immediate Manyano members only? And then There's a question from Dr. Motuachai asking, good afternoon and congratulations, Lisa, on your book. Have you touched on the issue of finances and umanyano? Umanyano has become a source of financial demands, and so there's greed playing itself out, also with the different factions of the churches. Did you get any insights about that from the women that you spoke to? Oh, and then another question from Joe again saying, did you notice any difference between educated and illiterate women of Umanyano?
Okay, I'll just start. Thank you so much for those questions. I'll just start with the public-private question. I think it was very difficult to find a conceptual framework that would be able to explain the history of the public and the private sphere, where it emerged from. But that we can further develop the private-public debate in relation to South Africa. And unfortunately, at the time, there really was not much literature on it, And Habermas was seen as this go-to person on, the founding father of, understanding the public sphere and how the public sphere operates and how it was shaped and how it emerged. And then I came across Dawson, who spoke about the counter-public in the United States and how specifically marginalized communities create a counter to the dominant public, in which they're able to create and devise their own strategies, specifically around politics, religion, and so on and so forth. But I also found that limiting in that it did not give me what I needed to find out in relation to gender. How this counter-public, if we're going to use it as a theoretical tool or framework, how does that apply specifically in the South African context, and how then does that apply for Black women? Because there must be something that is fundamentally different. And then I went and read up on Mamdani, who I love the concept on the bifurcated nature of South Africa, on the African continent in general, where we're existing in two worlds, and there's just a bifurcated nature of being, where there's one part of being that really does not fit into this other this other sort of structural post-apartheid democratic dispensation idea of how one is supposed to be, and how the democratic state recognizes the beings of human beings, of people. Sorry. So I struggled to understand that, and so what I tried to do was to pull all three with a feminist lens, and to try and understand that although through the colonial and the apartheid imposition and the ways in which it structured the public sphere around race and specifically around gender, which created the divide between the home and the public sphere, I saw that, of course, that did happen, but I wanted to find out what was it before then, so then we can sort of find out then how then do we then come to this particular point. And before this idea of the public and the private, I made use of Oyewumi's work, as well as Ifi Amaidume, who really spoke about the ways in which there really was no distinct private and public. There really was, and also matriarchal and patriarchal foundations weren't at loggerheads. These were ways of ordering society that were mutually enforcing, mutually constituted, along race, along seniority, along positionality within the communities, and along the wealth which you had in your community. So all of these were speaking to a different kind of public, or different type of ordering of society, rather, that was shaped not around gender and class, but other markers that are still quite prominent in our community. So seniority, for example, is quite a prominent identity for women, specifically for Black women, not only in the church, but in our communities as well. We know that if someone passes away, there will always be, there's always that go-to person in the community that we go to. So seniority becomes a thing that plays into debunking this idea of gendered public and private spheres. We also, the authority that she holds within the community as well plays quite a prominent role. And so most of the times these are without gender. But also you find that women are also being seen, women are also occupying roles of seniority in our communities above men who are part of those communities. So women have the ability to transcend and to make use of their authority in the public sphere, or in the public sphere that we know culturally. They're able to assert their dominance and their authority in particular ways just because of just who they are. And that reading then of the public and private spheres according to gender and race, which was conceptualized by Habermas, really did not fit the ways in which I culturally understood authority, and I culturally understood people's role, and how the home in and of itself wasn't always a site of oppression, but the home also became a space in which women are also able to flex. They're able to assert their domination, to assert their sense of authority in ways that I don't think the public and private sphere demarcations allow for us to be able to understand why that is so. And so it is important then to move away from markers such as gender and race, but to also look at things such as seniority. And a lot of our matriarchal foundations that allow for women to go beyond the dictates of patriarchy are based most of the time on seniority. And seniority doesn't necessarily mean age. It also just means the seniority in terms of authority and seniority in terms of your position within that particular community. So things like Kutatebao, the oldest daughter in someone's home, she's seen as quite a prominent figure in the family, and things don't start until she arrives. Your maternal grandmothers, all of those, and the lines of lineage. So you see that women from paternal society, for our paternal wing of our families, they sometimes have quite a lot of authority. And we also see that women from the maternal side of our families, they have quite a lot of authority. So all of those things speak to, just try to show us that we cannot really perfectly fit in this idea of the public and the private sphere. And I do think that for white women, it probably works for them because that's their context that they're writing from. And for white feminists as well, that's the world that they know. But I don't think for us, as Oyewumi says, that we actually need to speak about the cultural specificities within our context and how these operate significantly different from the ways in which we have been taught as social science scholars that are interested in these type of theories, such as the public sphere and the private sphere. So finance projects. So a lot of the Manyano, what are the projects that Manyano women do? So they run a lot of community-based projects. So these can range from soup kitchens to, Istokvela, to little initiatives such as feeding the hungry, going out to pray in the hospitals. And all of these are quite, they're localized most of the time. They don't really part and parcel of our everyday big developmental projects that we see. So they're really quite inward looking. And I also think that's fine. They don't have to be these grand developmental strategies that they can, or projects. In terms of Mamabo Manyano and the finances. So I think a prominent part of the Manyano group, specifically around finances, is around this thing of burial societies. And what that those societies do is that they offer economic relief when someone has passed away to the person that is a member of the Manyano group. And so in the absence of these women being able to take out an account at Sanlam or wherever, Old Mutual or whatever the case may be, they offer that type of security for a lot of the women, because a lot of them are uneducated, as I've said. A lot of them do not have access to these funeral policies. Now we're seeing that you can get one for 50 Rand at Ackermans, but the majority of their financial responsibility, specifically within the church and umgalelo, is really around being able to give the family of the bereaved a dignified burial. And so the demands of that are some people do find that it's quite a high amount, but for a majority of the Manyano women who are specifically in the deep rural Eastern Cape, they pay something close to like 50 Rand a month, 100 Rand at best. And that gives the type of financial security that is needed at a funeral. So there are those types of projects. Again, they're very quite inward looking. Yeah, I don't know if I've answered. I think I've just touched about it. Oh, and the difference between the illiterate and the ones that aren't educated and the ones that were, there really was no difference insofar as who gets to join and sharing their insights. As I've said, most of my participants were uneducated formally. But and what she's finding is that the prominent members of Manyano really are the ones that really haven't had formal education. So Unobala, the vice president, you'll find that Vice is probably a domestic worker, but on a Sunday, she is the vice president or she's the president of the grouping. So they're really that class, what the Manyano do, which is quite interesting, that the class dynamics also seem to be not as prominent and not as noticed, because when you're wearing your uniform, you're just a Manyano who is Unobala. It's only when you get to speak to the woman that you know, okay, Mom so-and-so is a nurse, Mom so-and-so is a domestic worker. And so what that does then, it strips away the messiness of class that arranges people according to what buy-in they have and the ability then to assert their authority according to class. So Manyano really do a lot for destabilizing class dynamics within their groupings. Yeah.
Thanks so much for bringing in that class dynamic, because there was a question here also from Zugiswa Hans asking, were you able to decipher the code of the Manyanos attracting lower earning to unemployed women and not those who have made it or are making it? But the thing is that the Manyano attracts women of all classes and always has. And you'll have women of a lower socioeconomic background having authority over women of a higher socioeconomic background or greater education within the institution of Manyano. You speak at length about Umamwini and her role as a Manyano woman, and she was her house, her home was down the road from my grandparents, my maternal grandparents, and Mum would come to funerals as an ordinary member of Manyano and come pay her respects as a member of Manyano, not in the status as Winnie Madikizela Mandela, but actually as a member. So that the politics of power and social class, which is a question that's been asked by Mukibelo and Chabeleng, I think one of the things about Manyano is that it flattens those within that institution. Yeah. In some ways, in many ways, actually. There's a final question here. We are at the end we're at 2:00, so we're going to go towards closing. There's a question here from TK Bowe asking, from an aspirational perspective, what drives these women's aspirations outside the church? I'd like you to close on an answer to that question, but just also a reflection on what you think the role of Manyano is going to continue to be in South Africa in our future. Did you see that there were young women who were ready to take up that role?
Yeah. So just to answer this question, what drives these women's aspirations outside of the church? I'm not sure, because a lot of them church is quite a big deal for them. And I don't say this in a patronizing way. It really is a powerful resource for them, and most of their aspirations are derived from spirituality and their connection with God and the ways in which they identify themselves as being part of, they identify themselves as being on a journey through spirituality. And so their aspirations are they're very much connected and rooted within the church. And also because, specifically for the women that I've interviewed, a lot of them are towards the end of their days. Sorry to say that, but they're quite old. And so what they really are doing now is really just living out their best days in the church and really just continuing to be Manyano and still, you know, hobbling on their walking sticks to church, which is just something that I'm still quite moved by, that someone could have lived, someone could be part of this organization for 40 years, 50 years for most of them, and they're still they're holding on to that. And the Manyano women of today, people are joining. I think, like you've said, it's a cultural institution for a lot of us, even though, you know, some people aren't Christian, but they identify with Manyano as a cultural phenomenon, and they still are holding on to the rituals that come with being associated with that particular grouping. So we still want our parents to be buried by Ikawa. We still want our parents, if they pass away, we still want that long vigil, you know, with the singing and the, you know, and all of that. We still want that because we know culturally what that means for the person that would have passed away, but also just for us as well, to just be able to be rooted in that type of community. And for the younger Manyano, I'm not sure. And I think that it would be quite interesting for somebody to do some type of work around what's up with the new Manyano. You know, what are they doing? What are they up to? Do they identify with the dominant ways of being and the rigidity with which one must confine to when you're part of the Manyano groupings? And is there a breakaway between the different generations, and what can we see from them, and what kind of conversations are happening intergenerationally? But yeah, this is I think it's important for us to keep doing this type of work that most of the time will be seen as anecdotal, but we know that in our hearts of heart that this is a profound institution, and institutions like these deserve the type of academic rigor that, you know, that a lot of other sort of key political topics are given, and this is one of them. And we really need to start developing and training young academics that are interested in this type of work and to see the cultural relevance of this type of work. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that, Lihle. A big round of applause from me, and thank you to everyone who's joined us for this conversation. This is really an exceptional piece of work. Please, if you haven't bought the book, buy it and give it as gifts. We're coming to Christmas, so buy it for every Mama Manyano in your family to read and to have next to the portrait, because I think that it really is such an important part of us understanding who we are and learning about ourselves. Thank you to the Wits School of Governance for inviting me to facilitate this conversation. Thank you to all the audience members, and thank you to Lerato at Wits for putting all of this together, and to Kamantha. It's been really fantastic, and I hope you have all a wonderful afternoon. Thanks, Lihle. Keep well.
Thank you, Lerato. Thanks, Kamantha. Thanks.